The first week of Thomas Reed's appointment as warden of Alabama State Prison felt less like the beginning of a new career and more like stepping into a fortress where hope had long ago surrendered. Every corridor echoed with clanging steel doors, distant arguments, and the slow shuffle of inmates moving under constant supervision. The prison carried a reputation for housing some of the state's most dangerous offenders, yet Thomas believed discipline, fairness, and consistency could restore order where fear had become routine. He walked the cell blocks each morning instead of hiding behind his office desk, determined to understand the people living behind the concrete walls before judging them by their convictions. Veteran correctional officers watched him with quiet skepticism. Most had served inside these walls for decades and doubted the optimism of another newcomer. They offered practical advice, warning him about violent gang leaders, manipulative inmates, and officers who had grown too comfortable cutting corners. Yet one name surfaced repeatedly in conversations, spoken with neither fear nor respect but something far more unsettling. Danielle Brooks. Unlike the others, no one described her crime first. Instead, they described the silence. Cell 214, Sergeant Harold Mills muttered during an afternoon inspection. She doesn't fight, doesn't beg, doesn't cry, just watches. Thomas frowned. Watches what? Everything. The answer lingered in his thoughts as they approached the women's maximum security wing. Most inmates reacted immediately to the warden's arrival. Some shouted complaints through the bars. Others demanded favors or cursed loudly enough to draw attention. Danielle did none of those things. She sat on the narrow edge of her bunk with a paperback novel resting unopened in her lap. Her posture was perfectly still, almost rehearsed. Dark hair framed a face untouched by panic or anger, and calm gray eyes followed every movement outside the cell without appearing curious. She acknowledged Thomas with a slow glance before returning her attention to the corridor, as though she had expected him all along. There she is, Mills whispered. Never causes trouble. Thomas stepped closer. Ms. Brooks. She looked up. So you're the new warden. Her voice carried neither hostility nor friendliness. It sounded measured, almost analytical. I wondered how long it would take before you came looking. Thomas studied her expression. There was no visible challenge, only quiet confidence. You knew I would? You've been asking questions. He paused. I ask questions about everyone. No, Danielle replied softly. You've been asking the right questions. Before Thomas could respond, another inmate began yelling from nearby cells, demanding medical attention. Officers rushed toward the disturbance while Danielle remained perfectly composed, barely acknowledging the chaos unfolding around her. You don't seem surprised, Thomas observed. Nothing here surprises me anymore. The words should have sounded defeated. Instead, they carried the certainty of someone who had stopped expecting the world to make sense years earlier. Thomas noticed shelves stacked with neatly arranged books, handwritten notes, and legal documents. Unlike neighboring cells filled with clutter and frustration, hers reflected remarkable discipline. Every object had a place. You spend a lot of time reading. I spend a lot of time remembering. Before he could ask what she meant, Sergeant Mills signaled that they needed to continue the inspection. Thomas nodded politely. I'll be seeing you again. I know. He turned to leave. Behind him, Danielle spoke one final sentence. Warden Reed. He looked back. Be careful what you think you're protecting. Thomas waited for her to explain, but she simply lowered her eyes to the unopened book. What does that mean? He asked. A faint smile crossed her face for the first time. Some prisons are built from concrete, she said quietly. The dangerous ones are built from secrets. The heavy steel door closed between them as Thomas continued down the corridor, unable to shake the strange feeling that their conversation had been less an introduction than the opening move in a game whose rules he did not yet understand. That evening, alone in his office, he requested Danielle Brooks's complete inmate file, unaware that several pages had already disappeared long before he arrived. Thomas Reed closed Danielle Brooks's file long after midnight, but the unanswered questions refused to leave his mind. The inmate record looked incomplete from the moment he opened it. Several pages had clearly been removed, psychological evaluations ended abruptly, and references to supporting documents led to folders that no longer existed. Someone had carefully erased parts of Danielle's history, leaving behind only enough information to satisfy routine inspections while concealing something far more significant. The following morning, Thomas requested archived records from the prison's storage facility. The elderly records clerk frowned as she searched the database. "That's strange," she murmured. "What is?" Several boxes connected to Danielle's case were checked out years ago. "Who signed them out?" She hesitated. "The authorization number is missing." Thomas left with more questions than answers. Throughout the week, he quietly reviewed disciplinary reports, medical summaries, and court documents. Dates failed to match. Witness statements referred to interviews that had vanished. Even photographs listed in evidence inventories could not be located. Administrative errors happened in every institution, but this pattern felt deliberate. Someone had rewritten Danielle's history. During his afternoon inspection of the women's housing unit, Danielle looked up from the book resting in her lap. "You found the missing pages," she said calmly. Thomas stopped outside cell 214. "You already knew. I knew you would notice." He studied her expression. "Who removed them?" She smiled faintly. "If I answered every question immediately, you wouldn't learn very much." Thomas almost walked away, but curiosity kept him standing there. Instead of pressing further, he changed the subject. "How did you know I'd request the archives?" "Because you still believe paperwork tells the truth." "And you don't?" "I believe people decide which truths become paperwork." Her answer lingered with him long after he continued his inspection. 2 days later, Danielle requested a private conversation. "I have information," she said quietly. "About what?" "Officer Daniel Lang." Thomas folded his arms. "What about him?" "Check the medication inventory from the infirmary against last month's transfer records." She offered nothing more. Thomas investigated discreetly. Pharmacy logs revealed repeated shortages, hidden beneath altered inventory reports. A surprise audit uncovered prescription medications missing from secure storage, and security footage placed Officer Lang inside restricted medical areas without authorization. Confronted with the evidence, Lang resigned before criminal charges could be filed. Word spread quickly through the prison. Some officers praised Thomas for exposing corruption. Others blamed Danielle. Within another week, she approached him again. "This time it's gambling," she said. "Who?" "Follow the night shift overtime records." Again, her information proved accurate. Illegal betting pools involving correctional staff had been operating for months using inmate commissary funds as payment. The scheme collapsed after another internal investigation. Thomas could no longer dismiss Danielle's knowledge as coincidence. Their conversations gradually became routine. At first, they spoke only about prison procedures. Soon they discussed criminal psychology, justice, and why some people changed while others embraced violence. Danielle never asked for favors, shorter sentences, or improved living conditions. She simply answered questions with unsettling precision. "Why help me?" Thomas asked one afternoon. "Because corruption destroys everyone eventually." "You expect me to believe that's your only reason?" "No," she replied. "I expect you to discover the rest yourself." Around them, whispers multiplied. Some inmates insisted Danielle had found a way to manipulate the new warden. Certain officers quietly joked that Thomas visited cell 214 more often than his own administrative office. Sergeant Harold Mills eventually approached him. "Sir, people are talking. They're free to talk. Just be careful who benefits." Thomas dismissed the warning, believing professionalism would protect both his reputation and his judgment. Neither he nor Danielle noticed the tiny surveillance camera positioned above the corridor intersection. Inside the prison's security office, an unseen employee replayed footage of every conversation between the warden and the inmate. Each recording was labeled with dates, times, and handwritten notes before being locked inside a drawer, already filled with confidential files bearing Danielle Brooks's name. Someone wasn't merely watching them. Someone was waiting for the perfect moment to use what they saw. The surveillance footage remained locked inside a secured cabinet, but its existence marked an invisible turning point neither Thomas Reed nor Danielle Brooks could have anticipated. While someone quietly collected recordings of their conversations, Life inside Alabama State Prison settled into an uneasy routine. To Thomas, Danielle had become more than another inmate. She had become the one person inside the prison who answered questions without pretending the world was simpler than it truly was. One rainy afternoon, Thomas stopped outside cell 214, carrying a stack of inspection reports. Danielle was sitting by the narrow window, watching raindrops slide down the reinforced glass. "You seem distracted," she said before he spoke. "I'm beginning to think everyone here knows what I'm feeling before I do." She gave a faint smile. "Only the people who've spent years studying human behavior." Thomas leaned against the bars. "And you're one of them?" "I've had plenty of time." Silence settled between them before Thomas asked the question that had lingered in his mind for weeks. What happened before prison? Danielle remained motionless. For a long moment, Thomas thought she would refuse to answer. Instead, she closed the book resting in her lap and looked toward the gray sky beyond the tiny window. "I was born into a house where fear was ordinary," she began quietly. "My father believed pain was discipline, and my mother believed surviving was the same as living." Her voice never trembled. "When I was 8, I learned that telling the truth only made the beatings worse. By 12, I knew strangers could hurt you just as easily as family if they thought nobody would believe you." Thomas listened without interruption. "I kept waiting for an adult to save me," Danielle continued. "Teachers looked away. Neighbors heard screaming and closed their windows. Eventually, I stopped expecting anyone to come. The corridor outside the cell seemed unusually still. When I turned 17, I trusted someone who promised to give me a better life. Instead, he used me, controlled me, and convinced me I deserved every terrible thing that happened afterward." She paused, taking a slow breath. "People always ask about the night I committed my crime. They never ask about the 1,000 nights that made it possible." Thomas found himself struggling to respond. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Danielle shook her head. "Don't apologize for things you didn't do." Yet those words only deepened the weight pressing against his conscience. Over the following weeks, their conversations became increasingly personal. Thomas admitted that he had sacrificed nearly every meaningful relationship in pursuit of his career. Long hours, endless transfers, and constant responsibility had slowly emptied his private life until the prison became the only place he truly belonged. "I used to think duty would be enough," he confessed one afternoon. "And was it? For a while. What changed? I stopped remembering what life outside these walls felt like." Danielle studied him carefully. Loneliness makes people overlook boundaries. Thomas understood exactly what she meant. He reminded himself repeatedly that she was an inmate and he was the warden. Every professional rule demanded emotional distance. Yet each conversation chipped away at that distance until speaking with Danielle became part of his daily routine. Correctional officers noticed. Some exchanged suspicious glances whenever Thomas entered the women's unit. Others fell silent as he walked past. Sergeant Harold Mills warned him gently. "People are talking, sir. They always talk. This feels different." Thomas dismissed the concern, convinced he remained in control of the situation. He never saw the tiny surveillance camera mounted above the corridor capturing every visit. Hidden monitors recorded their conversations, their expressions, and the growing familiarity between them. Somewhere else in the prison, someone carefully labeled each recording with dates and times, building a collection far more dangerous than either of them realized. Danielle sensed the prison changing before Thomas did. "The walls are listening," she whispered one evening. He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Someone doesn't like us asking questions." Thomas glanced down the empty hallway. There was no one there, or so it seemed. Far beyond cell 214, behind a locked security office where only authorized personnel could enter, another recording began to play. As the screen flickered with images of Thomas and Danielle talking through the bars, an unseen hand reached for a telephone. A calm voice spoke only 6 words. "They're getting too close. Move now." The words spoken over the telephone echoed through unseen corridors, but Thomas Reed never heard them. The following morning began like countless others inside Alabama State Prison until a violent fight erupted in the maximum security housing unit. What started as a confrontation between rival inmate groups quickly spread through adjoining cell blocks. Shouting turned into chaos. Metal trays crashed against bars, alarms blared, and officers rushed to contain the disturbance before it consumed the entire facility. Thomas moved toward the scene alongside the emergency response team, issuing calm, direct orders despite the confusion surrounding him. Smoke from a small fire deliberately set inside a storage room drifted through one of the prison corridors, forcing staff to redirect inmates away from the affected area. Medical personnel called for immediate assistance after several officers and prisoners suffered injuries during the unrest. The prison entered full lockdown. As Thomas coordinated evacuation procedures, a nurse informed him that Danielle Brooks had been transferred to the isolated medical wing after inhaling smoke while helping another inmate escape the spreading fire. Believing she might possess information about how the disturbance had begun, Thomas headed toward the secure treatment area. Moments after he entered, the reinforced security doors slammed shut. A damaged electronic control panel refused to respond. The system's frozen. A voice shouted from the opposite hallway, "Stay where you are until maintenance resets it." Thomas tried the emergency release without success. Thick steel doors separated him and Danielle from the rest of the prison. Hours passed. Outside, officers struggled to regain control of the institution, while technicians worked to restore damaged security systems. Inside the quiet medical wing, the sounds of violence became distant echoes. Danielle sat on an examination bed with a bandage wrapped around one forearm. "You should be out there," she said. "I can't." "You'll blame yourself." "I already do." For the first time since becoming warden, Thomas admitted how overwhelming the responsibility had become. Every decision carried consequences. Every mistake threatened lives. He confessed that despite being surrounded by hundreds of people every day, he had never felt more isolated. "I thought this job meant protecting people," he said quietly. "And now I wonder whether I've been protecting an institution instead." Danielle listened without judgment. "My whole life," she replied, "I've waited for someone to see me as more than the worst thing I've ever done." Thomas looked at her. "I do." The words escaped before he could reconsider them. Silence filled the room. Neither spoke for several moments. Fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty blurred emotions that had been carefully restrained for weeks. Their conversation turned deeply personal as they acknowledged the loneliness that had quietly shaped both of their lives. In that fragile moment, professional boundaries gave way to emotional vulnerability, and they shared an intimate encounter neither had imagined when Thomas first walked into cell 214. When the security doors finally reopened, reality returned with startling force. Neither mentioned what had happened. Thomas escorted Danielle back to her housing unit without speaking. The distance between them felt heavier than any prison wall. During the following days, Danielle changed. She declined conversations that she once welcomed. Her answers became brief. She often stared silently through the narrow window of her cell, avoiding Thomas's eyes whenever he stopped outside cell 214. He assumed guilt or regret had created the sudden distance, but something deeper seemed to trouble her. "What is it?" he asked during one visit. "I'm tired," she answered. "I don't believe that's all." She managed a faint smile. Some truths arrived too late. Before Thomas could ask what she meant, another inmate walking past the corridor slowed almost imperceptibly. Concealed inside a folded legal folder was a small contraband cell phone. With practiced precision, the inmate secretly captured several photographs showing Thomas standing unusually close to Danielle's cell, images that suggested far more than ordinary conversation. The phone disappeared before anyone noticed. Elsewhere, Danielle sat alone on her bunk after lights out, gripping a folded medical document hidden inside one of her books. She had read its contents dozens of times, yet the words never became easier to face. The paper contained a diagnosis she had concealed from nearly everyone for years, one she had intended never to involve another person. Tears gathered in her eyes as she whispered into the darkness, "I'm so sorry." Outside her cell, unseen cameras continued recording every hallway, every meeting, and every secret, while events already set in motion moved steadily toward consequences neither Thomas nor Danielle could yet imagine. Danielle's whispered apology echoed in Thomas Reed's memory long after he left the women's housing unit. He convinced himself that her sudden withdrawal came from regret over the line they had crossed during the lockdown. Determined to restore professional distance, he buried himself in administrative work, hoping routine would silence the growing unease that followed him through every corridor of Alabama State Prison. Weeks passed. The prison gradually returned to normal operations after the riot, though tension still lingered beneath the surface. Internal reviews, damaged property reports, and disciplinary hearings consumed Thomas's days. Yet something else demanded his attention. It began with exhaustion. At first, he blamed the endless overtime and emotional strain. He woke each morning feeling as though he had never slept. Simple tasks required unusual effort, and persistent headaches settled behind his eyes. Soon came recurring fevers, swollen lymph nodes, and a lingering sore throat that refused to disappear. "You look terrible, sir," Sergeant Harold Mills remarked one afternoon. "I've had worse. You should see a doctor." Thomas reluctantly scheduled an appointment during a routine employee wellness examination, expecting nothing more serious than stress or a stubborn virus. Blood samples were collected, standard questions were asked, and he returned to work without another thought. 3 days later, his phone rang just before sunset. The prison physician requested an immediate meeting. The urgency in the doctor's voice sent a chill through him. Inside the small medical office, the atmosphere felt unusually heavy. The physician closed the door before speaking. "Warden Reed, one of your laboratory results requires additional confirmation." Thomas frowned. "What kind of result?" The doctor hesitated. "Your screening test came back reactive for HIV." The words seemed to drain every sound from the room. Thomas stared across the desk, convinced he had misunderstood. "That's impossible. We've already ordered a confirmatory test. There has to be a mistake. I understand this is overwhelming." Days later, the second test confirmed the first. Thomas Reed was living with HIV. He left the clinic carrying a sealed envelope that suddenly felt heavier than every prison file he had ever opened. Sitting alone inside his office after dark, he read the diagnosis again and again, hoping the words would somehow change. They never did. His thoughts raced through every possibility. A medical procedure, an accidental exposure, a laboratory error. Then, despite every effort to avoid it, his mind returned to the isolated medical wing during the prison lockdown. Danielle. He buried his face in his hands. The realization struck with devastating force. At the same time, confidential public health procedures quietly began. Medical investigators contacted the prison administration under strict privacy guidelines, seeking information that could help identify the likely source and timeline of exposure. Their questions remained professional and discreet, avoiding unnecessary disclosure while requesting employment records, medical incidents, and relevant contacts. Thomas cooperated without revealing the truth behind his growing fear. Each evening he replayed every conversation, every decision, and every warning Danielle had ever given him. One sentence refused to leave him. Some truths arrived too late. Suddenly, those words carried a meaning he had never imagined. Unable to ignore the possibility any longer, Thomas visited cell 214 after evening count. Danielle looked up as he approached. She immediately recognized something had changed. "You know," she said quietly. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Tell me it isn't true." She lowered her eyes. "I can't." "Did you know?" Silence. "Danielle, I can't talk about my medical history." His breathing grew uneven. "You owed me the truth." Pain filled her expression. "I owed you many things. Answer me." She gripped the edge of the bunk so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "There are reasons I can't." Before Thomas could press further, prison medical staff arrived with official paperwork requesting Danielle's presence for confidential interviews regarding previously documented health records. She refused every request to discuss her diagnosis or answer questions beyond what the law required. As officers escorted her toward the infirmary, Danielle glanced back only once. The sorrow in her eyes revealed she had been carrying a burden far greater than Thomas had ever understood. Watching from the end of the corridor, hidden beyond the security gate, Another prison employee quietly folded a newspaper around several printed photographs showing Thomas and Danielle together. The scandal was no longer just a secret. It was becoming a weapon. The envelope of photographs changed hands before the week was over. No one knew exactly who leaked the confidential information, but inside Alabama State Prison, secrets rarely stayed buried for long. What began as whispered speculation quickly became accepted as fact. Officers stopped talking when Thomas Reed entered a room. Conversations ended abruptly in hallways. Even employees who had once respected his leadership now avoided meeting his eyes. The rumors spread faster than any official investigation could contain them. The inmate gave the warden HIV. She planned it. She trapped him from the beginning. By the time those stories reached the inmate population, they had grown even darker. Danielle Brooks was no longer viewed as a quiet prisoner with an unreadable past. She became the woman everyone believed had deliberately destroyed the prison's highest-ranking official. Hatred followed almost immediately. Some inmates shouted insults whenever she was escorted through the corridors. Others threw food trays, paper, and cups of water toward her cell. Several correctional officers, despite repeated warnings from supervisors, treated her with open contempt. Meals arrived late. Routine requests were ignored. Every glance she received carried silent judgment. Danielle never defended herself. She accepted every insult with the same unsettling calm she had displayed since Thomas first met her. Yet once the cell door closed each evening, the strength she showed the world quietly disappeared. One night she unfolded an old photograph hidden inside a legal textbook. The edges had faded with time. In the picture stood a frightened 19-year-old Danielle beside a smiling man nearly twice her age. His name was Victor Hale. Years before prison, Victor had promised safety, affection, and a fresh start. Instead, he isolated her from friends, controlled every decision she made, and convinced her that no one else would ever love her. Emotional manipulation gradually became physical violence, followed by repeated assaults that left scars invisible to everyone except Danielle. When she became seriously ill, Victor refused to let her seek medical treatment. "You belong to me," he had whispered. "You don't need anyone else." Months later, after collapsing at a clinic she secretly visited, doctors delivered the diagnosis that shattered her future. She was HIV positive. The physician carefully explained that modern treatment could help her live a long life. But Danielle barely heard the words. Her thoughts remained fixed on one unbearable realization. Victor had known. Medical records later confirmed he had been diagnosed long before meeting her and never disclosed his condition. He disappeared before police could question him. Danielle spent years blaming herself for trusting the wrong person. The abuse did not end there. Terrified, ashamed, and emotionally broken, she drifted into dangerous relationships and criminal circles where survival often required violence. The confrontation that eventually sent her to prison had been fueled by years of trauma, fear, and desperation rather than simple cruelty. None of those experiences erased responsibility for her crime, but they painted a far more complicated picture than the monster described in prison gossip. Back in the present, Thomas struggled to reconcile the woman he knew with the accusations surrounding her. He wanted answers. He also wanted someone to explain how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Medical investigators continued reviewing timelines, treatment histories, and confidential records. They carefully avoided assumptions, reminding prison officials that HIV transmission could not be established through rumor alone. Scientific evidence would determine facts, not speculation. Still, facts struggled to compete with outrage. News of the scandal quietly reached local media after an anonymous source leaked details of the investigation. Headlines hinted at forbidden relationships inside Alabama State Prison without confirming identities, but it did not take long for reporters to uncover names. Outside the prison gates, television cameras gathered. Commentators debated whether Danielle was a calculating predator or another victim abandoned by a broken system. Inside cell 214, Danielle listened to distant helicopters circling overhead. She closed her eyes as tears slowly rolled down her face. "I never wanted this," she whispered to the empty room. Elsewhere in the prison, Thomas sat across from investigators answering difficult questions about policy violations and undisclosed relationships. Every response drew them closer to the truth, yet another mystery continued growing in the background. Someone had leaked confidential medical records protected by law. Someone had taken secret photographs. Someone wanted Danielle condemned before the investigation was complete. And hidden deep within forgotten prison archives lay evidence suggesting the conspiracy had begun years before Thomas Reed ever walked through the front gates. The forgotten prison archives became the focus of an investigation that grew more disturbing with every document uncovered. What initially appeared to be an isolated scandal involving Thomas Reed and Danielle Brooks now pointed toward something far older and far more organized. Internal Affairs assigned senior investigator Laura Mitchell to conduct an independent review, determined to separate verified evidence from the rumors consuming Alabama State Prison. Mitchell trusted paperwork more than opinions. Within days, she discovered disciplinary reports that had been quietly altered, employee complaints that had disappeared from official files, and inmate medical records with pages deliberately removed. Several signatures appeared forged, while electronic logs showed repeated unauthorized access to confidential databases over nearly a decade. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone inside the prison administration had systematically erased evidence whenever misconduct threatened to expose influential employees. Thomas watched the investigation unfold with growing disbelief. "You think this goes beyond us?" he asked Mitchell during a private meeting. She closed another thick file before answering. "I think your relationship simply exposed a system that was already rotten." The words stayed with him long after the meeting ended. Meanwhile, Mitchell requested a confidential interview with Danielle Brooks. Escorted into a secure consultation room, Danielle appeared exhausted but composed. She sat quietly while Mitchell placed several documents across the table. "Do you recognize any of these names?" the investigator asked. Danielle studied the papers. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. "I know some of them. Were they involved in altering inmate records?" She remained silent for several seconds. "Not just records." Mitchell leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Danielle took a slow breath. For years, certain officers traded favors with vulnerable inmates. Medical files disappeared. Complaints vanished. Women who spoke too loudly were transferred or punished until they stopped talking. "Did you witness this yourself?" "More times than I wanted." Mitchell carefully switched on a digital recorder. "I need you to tell me everything." Danielle nodded. "I will." For the first time since Thomas arrived at the prison, Danielle agreed to provide a complete sworn statement. She admitted she had stayed silent for years because nobody believed inmates accusing correctional staff. Every attempt to report misconduct had mysteriously disappeared before reaching outside investigators. "I thought surviving was enough," she confessed. "But now people are getting hurt because I stayed quiet." Mitchell arranged another interview for the following morning, explaining that Danielle's testimony could become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. News of the scheduled statement remained confidential. At least it was supposed to. That evening, Danielle returned to cell 214 feeling something she had almost forgotten: hope. It lasted less than an hour. When officers conducted routine evening rounds, Danielle discovered a folded piece of paper pushed beneath her cell door. There was no signature, only 6 typed words. "Keep talking and you'll leave here dead." Her heartbeat quickened. She quickly hid the note before nearby inmates noticed. The following morning another message appeared, this time tucked inside a food tray delivered during breakfast. "Nobody can protect you forever." Danielle immediately requested to speak with Investigator Mitchell, but staffing shortages delayed the meeting until later that afternoon. Before anyone arrived, a third warning reached her. Someone had scratched words directly into the painted concrete beside her bunk. "We know what you remember." For the first time in years, genuine fear crossed Danielle's face. She realized the threats could only come from someone with unrestricted access to the housing unit. Ordinary inmates could not enter unnoticed. Visitors never reached maximum security alone. Whoever wanted her silent worked inside the prison. Elsewhere, Mitchell reviewed security footage hoping to identify anyone approaching cell 214 between patrols. Several camera angles abruptly froze during critical minutes before restarting without explanation. Maintenance logs claimed routine technical failures, yet Mitchell noticed identical malfunctions occurring whenever sensitive locations appeared on screen. Someone was manipulating the surveillance system. As evening settled over Alabama State Prison, Thomas received an urgent call from Mitchell. "You need to know this," she said quietly. "Danielle isn't just a witness anymore." "What is she?" "The most dangerous person in this prison." Thomas frowned. "Dangerous to whom?" Mitchell looked through the observation window toward cell 214, where Danielle sat alone under the dim lights. "To whoever has been hiding the truth all these years." Neither of them realized the people behind those secrets had already begun preparing a permanent solution. The promise of a permanent solution arrived before sunrise. Thomas Reed barely slept after investigator Laura Mitchell warned him that Danielle Brooks had become the most dangerous witness inside Alabama State Prison. He planned to meet Mitchell early that morning before Danielle's formal testimony began. The statement was expected to expose years of concealed misconduct, falsified records, and corruption reaching far beyond a single scandal. Danielle never made it to the interview room. At 5:42 a.m., Officer Kevin Morris unlocked the women's maximum security corridor for the morning count. Most inmates were already awake, standing beside their bunks as required by prison regulations. When he reached cell 214, he froze. Danielle Brooks was lying motionless on the concrete floor. The emergency alarm echoed through the housing unit. Medical staff rushed inside within minutes, but the prison physician quickly shook his head. Danielle had no pulse. Attempts at resuscitation were abandoned after confirming she had been dead for several hours. Thomas arrived just as officers secured the scene with yellow evidence tape. "What happened?" he demanded. Nobody answered immediately. The physician finally spoke. "She's gone." Thomas stepped toward the doorway before another officer blocked his path. "You can't enter, sir." His eyes remained fixed on Danielle. Only yesterday she had agreed to tell the truth. Now she was dead. Within an hour, senior administrators issued a preliminary statement describing the incident as an apparent suicide pending routine review. News spread rapidly through the prison, and many employees accepted the explanation without question. Thomas did not. Something felt wrong the moment he saw the cell. Danielle's bunk remained perfectly made. The legal papers she had organized for her testimony sat neatly stacked beside several books. Nothing inside the room suggested someone preparing to end her life. More troubling was the expression on her face. Instead of peaceful resignation, her features reflected unmistakable fear. Investigator Mitchell arrived shortly afterward. She slowly examined every inch of cell 214 before speaking. "Nobody touches anything." Crime scene technicians photographed the area while forensic specialists collected fingerprints, fibers, and biological evidence. Initial observations raised uncomfortable questions almost immediately. The locking mechanism showed faint scratch marks inconsistent with ordinary use. A small bruise appeared near Danielle's wrist. One of her legal folders had disappeared. Mitchell frowned. "Where are yesterday's interview notes?" Officers searched the cell. They found nothing. Thomas remembered Danielle hiding the threatening messages beneath her mattress. "They should be here," he insisted. Again, nothing. Someone had removed every warning before investigators arrived. Mitchell requested surveillance footage covering the previous 12 hours. The prison's security supervisor reluctantly accessed the recording system. At 1:18 a.m., every camera monitoring the women's housing unit suddenly displayed static. The interruption lasted exactly 23 minutes. When the images returned, the corridor appeared empty. No maintenance was scheduled, Mitchell observed. The supervisor avoided eye contact. Technical malfunction. She folded her arms. 3 cameras failed simultaneously? It happens. No, Mitchell replied. It doesn't. Forensic specialists continued processing evidence throughout the afternoon. A footwear impression lifted from the polished hallway floor did not match Danielle's prison-issued shoes or those assigned to officers officially working the overnight shift. Someone else had walked that corridor. Even more troubling, electronic access logs showed cell 214 had never been opened during the night. Yet microscopic examination of the lock revealed recent mechanical manipulation. "It looks like someone bypassed the electronic system," a forensic examiner explained. Thomas stared at the damaged mechanism. "So the logs were never supposed to record the entry." "Exactly." The official suicide theory began unraveling one detail at a time. Outside the prison gates, television reporters gathered after learning Danielle had died only hours before providing testimony in a major corruption investigation. Public suspicion grew almost instantly. Civil rights organizations demanded independent oversight, while state officials announced a preliminary review of prison procedures. Inside his office, Thomas sat alone holding the last note Danielle had secretly handed him weeks earlier. "Some prisons are built from concrete. The dangerous ones are built from secrets." He finally understood what she had meant. Before sunset, Mitchell entered his office carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside rested a single broken shirt button recovered from beneath Danielle's bunk. "It doesn't belong to her uniform," she said quietly. Thomas looked up. "Can it identify whoever was in that cell?" Mitchell nodded slowly. "If we're lucky." She paused before adding the words that changed the investigation forever. The laboratory also found foreign DNA under Danielle's fingernails. Thomas closed his eyes. She had not died alone. She had fought back. Danielle Brooks had fought back. Those 4 words echoed through every meeting that followed the discovery of foreign DNA beneath her fingernails. The evidence destroyed the certainty of the prison's suicide ruling and transformed her death into a homicide investigation. Public pressure intensified after Danielle's estranged mother and younger sister formally challenged the official conclusion, insisting she had been terrified in the days before her death and had repeatedly spoken about threats inside Alabama State Prison. The state responded by assigning Detective Sarah Bennett to lead an independent criminal investigation. Unlike investigators connected to the prison system, Bennett answered to no administrator inside Alabama State Prison. She arrived carrying only a notebook, a recorder, and a reputation for dismantling carefully constructed lies. Her first stop was cell 214. She remained inside for nearly an hour without speaking, studying every photograph, every measurement, and every forensic report collected after Danielle's death. Nothing about the scene suggested someone who had calmly chosen to end her own life. "This room tells a different story," she finally said. Investigator Laura Mitchell agreed. "It always has." The 2 women combined their findings, creating the first complete timeline assembled since Danielle's death. Missing minutes, altered reports, and contradictory witness statements began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle someone had desperately tried to scatter. Bennett's attention quickly shifted toward the prison's surveillance system. Technicians recovered deleted video fragments from backup servers administrators believed had already been erased. Most recordings remained corrupted, but one restored sequence revealed something critical. At 1:26 a.m. during the supposed camera malfunction, a shadow crossed the entrance to the women's housing unit. The figure wore a correctional officer's uniform. The face remained hidden. "Proves someone entered," Bennett said. "Proves more than that," Mitchell replied. "Someone expected the cameras to fail." Meanwhile, forensic computer specialists examined years of electronic prison records. Hidden audit logs revealed repeated unauthorized changes to inmate files, employee schedules, disciplinary reports, and confidential medical records. Many alterations occurred using administrator credentials assigned to supervisors who claimed they had never accessed the system during those hours. Someone had been operating inside the database with remarkable precision. Medical investigators uncovered another disturbing discovery. Danielle's health records contained missing laboratory results, altered treatment dates, and handwritten notes that had vanished from digital copies. Similar irregularities appeared in dozens of inmate files involving allegations of staff misconduct, suggesting a long-running effort to conceal evidence rather than isolated clerical mistakes. The corruption stretched across multiple departments: security, medical, administration, even evidence storage. Thomas Reed sat through interview after interview, answering painful questions about his relationship with Danielle. He accepted responsibility for violating professional boundaries, Yet every new discovery deepened his belief that their relationship had become convenient cover for crimes committed long before he ever accepted the position of warden. One afternoon, Bennett placed Danielle's recovered notebook on the table between them. Inside were pages of carefully written observations, names, dates, cell numbers, descriptions of missing paperwork, mentions of women transferred after reporting abuse. The final completed entry stopped Thomas cold. "If anything happens to me, don't let them call me a liar." He slowly closed the notebook. "I thought I was protecting the prison," he said quietly. Bennett studied him. "And now? I think I was protecting the people destroying it." For the first time since Danielle's death, Thomas allowed himself to confront a truth he had resisted from the beginning. Perhaps Danielle's greatest mistake had never been trusting him. Perhaps it had been deciding to speak at all. As investigators expanded the case, search warrants reached offices that had escaped scrutiny for years. Locked filing cabinets were opened. Personal computers were seized. Former employees suddenly hired attorneys instead of answering questions. Someone had orchestrated years of deception. Someone with authority. Late that evening, Bennett received an urgent call from the State Forensic Laboratory. The foreign DNA recovered beneath Danielle's fingernails had finally been identified. It belonged to a current prison employee. Before Bennett could notify Mitchell or Thomas, another message arrived. The employee whose DNA had been matched had failed to report for duty that morning, and no one could find him. The missing prison employee was arrested 4 days later in a neighboring county after abandoning his vehicle outside a deserted motel. Faced with overwhelming forensic evidence, he agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration during sentencing. His testimony exposed years of corruption that reached far beyond Danielle Brooks's death, leading prosecutors to file sweeping criminal charges against multiple current and former officials connected to Alabama State Prison. Months later, the courtroom became the place where hidden secrets finally surfaced. Former correctional officers, administrators, and medical personnel testified under oath about falsified reports, destroyed evidence, unauthorized access to confidential records, and repeated efforts to silence inmates who reported misconduct. Financial documents revealed illegal payments disguised as administrative expenses, while recovered surveillance files confirmed that security systems had been intentionally disabled on multiple occasions to conceal unauthorized activity inside restricted housing units. The conspiracy that investigators had slowly uncovered was no longer speculation. It was documented fact. One witness admitted altering disciplinary records. Another confessed to deleting medical files. A former supervisor acknowledged ordering employees to ignore complaints filed by vulnerable inmates because investigating them would create unwanted public attention. Each revelation deepened the jury's understanding of how a culture of secrecy had flourished for years inside the prison. The most emotionally charged testimony came from infectious disease specialists called by the prosecution and the defense. Using Danielle's treatment history, laboratory records, and modern medical research, they carefully explained the science surrounding HIV transmission. Their conclusion was unmistakable. There was no evidence Danielle had knowingly or intentionally infected Thomas Reed. Her medical records demonstrated she had remained in treatment for years after learning of her diagnosis and had never expressed any intention of harming another person. Experts testified that assumptions made by the public following the leaked information had been driven by fear rather than evidence. The courtroom fell silent. For months, Danielle had been portrayed as a calculating predator. The evidence told a different story. She had been a victim of abuse long before becoming a defendant, and later a witness whose decision to expose institutional corruption ultimately placed her life in danger. Families of former inmates wept quietly as additional victims described intimidation, retaliation, and years of ignored complaints. Several admitted they had remained silent because they believed no one would ever believe prisoners accusing correctional staff. Now finally someone had. Judge Eleanor Whitaker delivered lengthy remarks condemning the prison administration's failures before accepting guilty pleas from several defendants and imposing substantial prison sentences on others convicted after trial. She described the misconduct as a betrayal not only of inmates but also of every honest employee who had served the institution with integrity. Thomas Reed testified near the end of the proceedings. He never attempted to excuse his actions. "I violated the professional boundaries my position required," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion filling the courtroom. "No matter what feelings existed, I was responsible for protecting every person in that prison, including Danielle Brooks. My failure created circumstances that others exploited with devastating consequences." His statement drew no objections, only silence. When court adjourned, reporters rushed outside to announce the verdicts. Behind them, Thomas remained seated alone in the nearly empty courtroom, staring at the witness stand where Danielle should have been allowed to tell her own story. Justice had finally reached Alabama State Prison, but it had arrived too late to save the woman whose voice made the truth impossible to bury. Months passed after the final verdict, but the story refused to disappear. Newspaper headlines gradually faded, television cameras left the prison gates, and public attention shifted toward newer tragedies. Yet inside Alabama State Prison, Danielle Brooks's name remained impossible to erase. For some, she would always be remembered as the inmate whose forbidden relationship with a prison warden ended in scandal. For others, she became something far more significant. A woman whose decision to reveal institutional corruption exposed years of abuse hidden behind locked doors and official paperwork. The prison itself slowly began to change. Independent oversight committees reviewed inmate healthcare policies, confidential reporting procedures, and surveillance protocols. New regulations required stronger protections for whistleblowers, stricter safeguards for medical privacy, and routine external audits designed to prevent another culture of secrecy from taking root. The reforms arrived at an enormous cost, built upon evidence left behind by people who had paid for the truth with their lives and careers. Thomas Reed remained in his position long enough to help implement many of those changes before accepting a statewide role focused on correctional reform. Living with HIV required lifelong treatment, daily medication, and regular medical monitoring, but he refused to let the diagnosis define the rest of his life. Instead, he spoke openly about accountability, ethical leadership, and the importance of protecting both inmates and staff through transparency rather than silence. Whenever he addressed new correctional officers, he ended with the same message. Authority without integrity becomes another form of abuse. He never spoke those words without thinking about Danielle. The guilt never completely disappeared. He understood that his own choices had crossed professional boundaries that should never have been ignored. Although others exploited the situation for their own criminal purposes, he accepted that every tragedy often begins with one decision that feels harmless in the moment. Detective Sarah Bennett officially closed the homicide investigation after every remaining suspect had been prosecuted or cleared through forensic evidence. She placed the final report into an archive box, knowing the legal case had reached its conclusion even if the emotional wounds never truly would. Before leaving the evidence room, she paused beside one sealed container. Inside rested Danielle's worn paperback novel, the same one she had held when Thomas first met her in cell 214. Bennett quietly returned it to Danielle's family. No courtroom ruling could restore the years Danielle had lost to abuse, manipulation, imprisonment, and finally murder. Yet the truth she fought to reveal survived long after those responsible believed they had buried it forever. In the end, history remembered Danielle Brooks not as a monster or a saint, but as a deeply flawed woman caught inside a broken institution that rewarded silence and punished honesty. Her final act of courage exposed corruption that powerful people believed would never come to light. And perhaps that became the case's greatest legacy. Because the strongest prison is not always built from steel bars or concrete walls. Sometimes it is built from fear. Sometimes it is built from lies. And sometimes the deadliest prison of all is a system where silence becomes more powerful than any crime ever committed.